The following program is an MLWRadio.com production.
We are proud to represent the NWA. We're proud, second of all, maybe even first of all, to represent your company. I'm talking Jim Crockett Promotions. By being the World Tag Team Champions in various states, very easily, we are the best at what we do. You didn't hear any music. You didn't see any face paint. You don't see any glitter. What you see is plain boots and plain tights. And what you also saw was plain wrestling, which is on the marquee. These days, our business gets glamorized by different aspects and different people. That some of them like to call it showbiz. A lot of people like to think they're stars. Tully and myself, Ric Flair, James J. Dillon, know that stars are in the sky and stars are in Hollywood. What we are is professional athletes. And every time we come to a building, you gotta know, your brothers gotta know, those people that have watched us for a lot of years gotta know. That's the reason they keep coming back. And last but not least, we gotta know that whether we're sick, whether we're hurting a little bit, whether we got problems at home or we had problems making our plane, that we give you 110% because that's what you paid for. And regardless of what you think, Luger, these people that buy these tickets don't pay our salary. His brother, and he does, and they pay us real well because we're worth every nickel. Now, when you look in these eyes and you look at that match that just take place, you see a little Anderson fire coming back because that's my roots. I was learned it. I was taught the old way. It is take a body part and render it useless. And my friend, a three-legged table is worth nothing to anybody. So in the Crockett Cup, that 20-inch arm of yours, Luger, can be just as useless as the one we just showed you. We are the best. We are the Horsemen.
Back at ringside, Arn Anderson in the ring against Sam Houston. Arn Anderson, John, first time we've seen him here on the Worldwide Wrestling, but he brings quite a reputation with him.
He sure has an established background, that's for sure. And being out of the Anderson family, you know, he's a cousin of Ole and Gene. And that's quite a saying quite a lot right there. Got to have a lot of wrestling background, or you've been an Anderson or around the Anderson family. And he's an established star already, and we're going to see how he fares right now against Sam Houston.
Well, Arn Anderson working on Sam Houston. Good move there.
Welcome to WHW Monday. Tony Schiavone and Conrad Thompson talking about the great years of World Championship Wrestling, the NWA, and Jim Crockett Promotions. And now, let's go to the ring. And here's your co-host. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to What Happened When? Monday, right here on the MLW Radio Network, and the master of ceremonies, Mr. Tony Schiavone, is with us. Tony, what's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, Conrad, and hey, slapdicks all over the world. Good to be talking to you here on MLW Radio Network on What Happened When? Monday on the MLW Radio Network. It's good to be talking to you. We've had quite a week, to say the least. And we've got a great subject we'll be talking about this week, and that's my good friend and a guy who's really an icon in pro wrestling, if you think about it, through the years, and that's Arn Anderson.
I'm excited to talk about Arn. I want to talk about last week, too, but I feel like we should address the elephant in the room. We want to send our love and prayers to Ric Flair and his entire family. What a week he has had this week. I know you and I were both at the hospital, and it was quite a scene. And there's lots of fake news out there as to what was going on with Rick, but hopefully we're on the downhill slope now, and we're headed where we need to be, and things are making a turn, and he's kicking out. He's the dirtiest player in the game, and there's no way for us to really express our love and appreciation for Rick, because at the end of the day, this podcast only exists because Rick introduced you and I, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Rick has meant so much to me when I started my wrestling career and when I got to meet you and started this podcast. So I honestly owe Ric Flair so much, but I say that because I love the guy. Anybody who really knows him and is really close to him like you and I are loves the guy because he is such a giving person. And again, I've been thinking all week about his children, about Ashley, about David, about Megan, and of course about Wendy. And it's just been a tough week. It's been a tough week for anybody who knows him. And I know it's been a tough week for a lot of the fans who consider Ric Flair their favorite wrestler of all time and Ric Flair part of their childhood. Again, you know, a lot of times you hear people say what I consider now is a kind of a cliche, our thoughts and prayers are with him. They say that all the time. Our thoughts and prayers are with you. But now when it's happened to a close friend of yours, you really mean it. And you really feel that. And our thoughts and prayers are with the family.
Well said, Tony. I totally agree. You know, Rick's obviously got a little bit of time before he's completely out of the woods, but he has overcome everything else. I mean, dude survived a plane crash. He's going to be able to make it through this. We just need to stay positive, and I hope you appreciate that Tony and I haven't been tweeting details, and we're not going to. And so if he or I have ignored your requests about that, it's not because we don't value you as a listener or don't appreciate you, but out of respect for the family, what, you know, Dave and Megan and Ashley want out there, Dave and Megan and Ashley will push out there. And in the meantime, we'll just kind of stay out of the way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Also, we are very close to the family. We know the family, both you and I, and so we have been very, very close to it. And again, we're respecting their wishes before being someone that lets the fans know what's going on. I think if you really want to know what's going on with Rick, you should follow Charlotte or Ashley on Twitter, and they'll let you know what's going on with Rick. But you're right; he's making his way back. I just can't wait to reconnect with him again.
It's not really our place to be breaking news or sharing private information about someone in 2017. So instead, let's go do what we do every week here, and that's relive the good old days about one of the very greatest of all time, Mr. Arn Anderson. And I think most people most closely associate Arn with Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen. But that's not the reason we're talking about him this week. It's hard to believe this, but it's been 20 years since Arn gave his very impassioned My Spot promo on Monday Nitro. It went down on August 25th, 1997. That's this coming Friday. It'll be 20 years since he retired from in-ring competition and gave his spot to Kurt Hennig. And we're going to talk about that today, but let's kind of start at the beginning, I guess, Tony. When did you first meet Arn Anderson?
I first met Arn Anderson, Conrad, when we were doing the local promos in the back, as we always called it, at Jim Crockett Promotions. We're talking about probably 84, maybe at the end of, I started doing those at the end of 1983, so it's either the end of 83 or the beginning of 84. I'm thinking it's the beginning of 84. And he came in and started doing some promos, and I remember him wearing a New York Yankees hat.
Right.
That and I was thinking, and I immediately struck up a friendship with Arn Anderson, immediately, because he was just an engaging, entertaining guy. People know Arn Anderson for an entertaining, engaging guy on the air, but off the air, he's different, but still very entertaining and still very engaging. And we immediately struck up a friendship, and he was called Arn Anderson. And, you know, I got to know him, and I knew he was Marty Lundy from Rome, Georgia. And I remember giving him a hard time. I said, you may slap that New York Yankees hat on your head and say that you're a member from the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, but when you open your mouth, you're all Rome, Georgia. Because he was. He had right. He's always had a very Southern drawl. And I just thought it was funny. And he was good-natured. And some of his best work, fans on a national level, Conrad never saw.
Right.
And that's the local promos that we did in the back. And they were tremendous. They were absolutely tremendous. You know, we talk so much about guys getting over because of their work or guys getting over because of their way they could talk. He got over both ways.
Right.
He could do both.
Well,
and not many people can say that.
Let me ask you this. When you were talking about meeting him in the back doing local promos, can you pin that down to a year? I guess we should remind everybody right here that your first assignment was Starrcade 83, right?
Right. That's right.
When did you first meet Arn? 84?
84.
Okay.
It had to be.
Arn had
unless it was the end of '83. And again, the first thing that I ever did was go to Ric Flair's house, interview Ric Flair for Starrcade, and we're talking about October of '83. And then I went and worked Starrcade in November. But between October and November of '83, I started doing what we called interviews in the back, the local promos, every Wednesday. So you're looking at probably a total of 8 weeks of doing promos in the back before the calendar turned 84. So that's when I met Arn during that year of 1984.
It's worth mentioning here that Arn actually started wrestling in '82. He was trained by a fellow named Ted Lipscomb, and he broke in with his shoot name, Marty Lundy. He bounced around. He did some work with Southeastern Championship Wrestling in '83. He worked as part of Ron Fuller's stud stable. He wrestled as Super Olympia there for a little while, and he even won the NWA Southeastern Tag Titles 3 times with Mr. Olympia and friend of the show, Pat Rose. And just as an opportunity to catch up on some of the old timers, I guess, Pat Rose actually does a fishing radio program in Chattanooga these days, right, Tony?
Yes, he does.
How about that? It's such a small world. Eventually, though, one of the best things that ever happens to Arn Anderson early in his wrestling career, he meets Ric Flair. And according to the rumor and innuendo, Flair recommends him, as Flair did a lot back in those days, to Jim Crockett Promotions. Can you speak about what that process was like? Because at the time, I feel like a lot of people took for granted that as a touring NWA champion, Rick kind of has an opportunity to see the best of everybody. And then a lot of times he would come back to Jim Crockett and say, man, you got to see these guys. Is that how that goes down?
That's exactly how it goes down. That's how I started, basically. I did the interview with Ric Flair, and he went to Jimmy Crockett, and he said, we need to use this kid because he's a pretty good announcer. And that's how he would with a lot of guys. You know, Jimmy Crockett had pretty much an open door policy with wrestlers. And on the Wednesdays that we did the backstage interviews or the interviews in the back, pretty much wrestlers kind of had the run of the whole office. They would walk around and they would go into Jimmy's office or go into David's office and talk to them, or go see Sandy Scott, who worked in the office back then, or even, of course, Dusty, who was booking. They all had offices, and they would just roam around. One funny thing was that it was hard when we would be doing local promos. You know, you want to keep them going, right? One after another. 3, 2, 1, cut, or that's a wrap. Next one. And Gene Anderson would say, okay, next up is Arn. Let's see, Ole, Flair. Where's that goddamn Flair? That son of a bitch. Somebody go get him. We would always have to chase Ric Flair down, and somebody would go into Jimmy's office and get him, or they go into Dusty's office and get him, because Rick always had a cup of coffee in his hand walking around. So he would go in and talk to Jimmy about a lot of the guys.
Right.
And he talked about Arn because, again, I saw Arn Anderson first as a talker, but Rick saw him as a wrestler as well. And I didn't see him wrestle that much because Rick was on the road with him. Or saw him wrestle. So, yeah, he did. Rick did a lot of, I don't know if it's called politicking, if you want to call it that, but did a lot of communications with the front office, especially on Wednesday when everybody was in there.
Well, one of the first big breaks that Arn would get would be during his time he spent working for Watts in Mid-South. That happens towards the end of '84. He's there about 5.5 months. And according to the rumor and innuendo that's out there, while Arn was in the territory, he's in the locker room one day, and Junkyard Dog makes some sort of comment that Marty Lundy looks just like Ole Anderson. And he tells Watts to make him an Anderson. Eventually, when Arn is in Georgia and he has Matt Bourne on his side, who would eventually become Doink, they're working as a tag team here. Ole officially names Arn an Anderson. Do you remember hearing how Arn became an Anderson? Is that pretty much the timeline and the story that you've heard?
I never heard the Junkyard Dog part of it, but I always heard that Ole Anderson, the word was with us that Ole Anderson looked at him and said, "You're an Anderson.
Right.
You should be a member of the quote unquote Anderson family." And then of course that tied him into Ric Flair, because Flair was allegedly a cousin. Right, a cousin of the Andersons. So that kind of gave him the rub. Now, I didn't hear the Junkyard Dog part of it, but I can see that happening because, Junkyard was a very colorful guy in the back and had a good relationship with the boys. But there was no question, with the exception of this, Ole, they looked a lot alike with the beard and everything in the face, right? And the eyes maybe. But Arn Anderson's head was 10 times the size of anybody else's. I'm saying that. Hopefully that'll get back to him. The old pumpkin head, bucket head, as we called him. But yeah, they did look alike. And one thing, and this is one of the reasons that I really, when I was a wrestling fan, one of the reasons I was a big wrestling fan is because Ole Anderson was such a great talker.
Mm-hmm.
And he made it believable. And Arn Anderson was like that too. He made it believable. There were some times that Arn could get the comedy routine that we knew from Marty Lunday in the back off camera. He could mix that in with his Arn Anderson talk on camera. And those moments were priceless. But they talked a lot alike. They looked a lot alike. And that's why he became an Anderson.
After, a brief stint in Georgia, he winds up working in the Pensacola territory, and he loved that. And Arn would probably tell you that's some of the most fun he ever had in wrestling because he gets to hang out on the beach every day, and the territory wasn't super huge, so you could be at home every night. Compare that to, the Bill Watts territory where you're doing 2,000 or 3,000 miles a week. Here, you're able to town and then come back home and then be on the beach and then drive to the town and then come back home. He does that for about a year and a half. And he would tell you he had some of his most fun in wrestling during that time, but it's also when he's encouraged by Ric Flair to send a tape of himself to Jim Crockett Promotions, and he would get the tape to Dusty. Dusty, of course, at the time was booking the territory for Crockett. And according to the rumor and innuendo, there is a promo that Arn cut on the beach in Pensacola wearing the Yankees hat that Dusty fell in love with and encouraged him to come visit him at the Crockett office in Charlotte. Did you ever hear that story?
I remember seeing the tape. I can't tell you exactly what was on the tape, but I remember seeing it, and I remember thinking, boy, this guy can really talk. This guy is really, really good. Now, help me out here because I may be wrong with my years. When was that?
I'm of the opinion that would be late 84, very early 85.
Okay, so here I am saying that I met Arn Anderson in 84. I guess realistically it was probably early 85 where I met him. Because years, I want to make sure I get these right because years kind of run together for me right now, We're talking around 30-some years ago. But I remember seeing the tape. And I remember after that, you talked about him enjoying Pensacola. He and I talked about that a lot, about how wonderful it was working in Pensacola. It was the greatest territory ever to him. But now he had a chance to make some real big money.
Absolutely he did. And the legend goes, at least when you hear Arn tell it, that he waits forever to see Dusty. And then when Dusty finally calls him into his office, he asks, "Are you the kid on the tape in the Yankees hat?" He says, "Yes, sir." According to Arn, Dusty gets very quiet for an extended period of time and then says, "Well, go get over." So Arn didn't officially know, am I hired? When am I going to be paid? When am I starting? What town do I report to? But that's how he was hired. Go get over. The great advice from the American Dream, yeah. Dusty Rhodes. Eventually, he would come into Jim Crockett Promotions and he would start working with Manny Fernandez when he first gets there. Manny is a guy who is a little bit of a controversial figure in wrestling because depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. What say you? What's the scoop on Manny Fernandez, Tony?
Well, here's what I always heard about Manny Fernandez. I always heard that a lot of guys didn't like him because they couldn't believe anything he said.
Right.
Now, my relationship with Manny Fernandez was always a good one. And again, my relationship with Manny Fernandez came on Wednesdays when I held the microphone for him. And that was basically it. He seemed to get along with the guys. I know he had an extended period of time with Rick Rude as his tag team partner, World Tag Team Champions. And I always heard that he and Rude never got along, but I never saw that. And Manny never told me a lie that I know of. He may have.
Well,
okay.
Let me assure you, he did. You know, it feels like some of the stories that we hear from him over the years are just, I mean, the idea that anybody believes some of this stuff is hilarious.
Well, maybe it's an extension of your persona. You know, if you're going to bullshit on TV, you might as well bullshit in life, right? Some people would think that. I got to see Manny recently at an autograph signing in Allentown, Pennsylvania at Bud Carson's Pro Wrestling World. And, he's aged. He has a service dog with him now. And we talked, and it's the first time, Conrad's first time we had seen each other since back in the old Crockett days.
Wow.
And he was talking about the service dog, and he was talking about helping out veterans and his time in the war.
Oh, that's awesome.
And his time in Vietnam. And that was always
a hilarious tidbit, because for him to have been in the war when he said he would have been like 15 years old.
And that was always the talk, that he claimed he was in the war, and everybody said, there's no way he was in the war. And we're talking about the Vietnam War. Who am I to say, right?
Well, let's talk about Arn a little bit. Arn replaces Gene in the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. And in theory here, he's Ole's kayfabe nephew. And they would go on to win the NWA National Tag Team titles, which is essentially the Georgia territory. So it's Arn and Ole defeating Thunderbolt Patterson and Mandy Fernandez. That goes down in April of '85. You grew up where you could see some of the Georgia TV. Were you a big fan of the national titles, the national tag team titles? What did those mean back then?
Well, those, to me, they just meant the equivalent of the world tag team titles that the Crockett's had. They were the top tag team in the territory, much like the United States title was the top singles title at Crockett, and the national title was the top singles title in Georgia. That's kind of all it meant to me. And I saw Georgia Championship Wrestling on occasion. I didn't watch it religiously like I did Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling.
Let's talk a little bit about the big shows from the early days here in Mid-Atlantic. The Great American Bash from July 6, 1985, we would see Arn and Ole defeat Buzz Sawyer and Dick Slater. You ever talked to Arn about some of his favorite tag team opponents, and where do you reckon guys like Buzz Sawyer and Dick Slater would have fallen in line? These feel like two characters from wrestling's past that we'll probably never see again in the business, and that nobody like Buzz Sawyer or Dick Slater is coming down. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would agree. I would think as far as a classic worker, I would think that maybe Slater was a little bit better of a classic worker, because Buzz Sawyer was like a buzz saw. I mean, he was pretty rough. And when you would work with Buzz Sawyer and had a program with him, it really wasn't easy, because he was such a maniac. I mean, goodness gracious, I held the microphone for Buzz Sawyer many times in the back, to where he spit all over everybody, screaming and hollering. So it was, man, I'd love to see some of those matches.
Well, some of that stuff's out there. You can catch it on YouTube, or you can catch it on the WWE Network. I know for sure that Starrcade 85 from November 28th, where you would see Ole and Arn take on and defeat Wahoo McDaniel and Billy Jack Haynes. That's out there. Wahoo McDaniel is somebody that Ric Flair always talks about affectionately as being one of the greatest of all time. And he feels like it's a straight up travesty that dude's not in the Hall of Fame. How important was Wahoo McDaniel to the Jim Crockett promotion territory and just wrestling as a whole?
Well, Wahoo McDaniel was, when I was watching wrestling, Conrad was their top babyface. And then, of course, he became, as I started working in Jim Crockett promotions, he became a great heel as well. And I can tell you right now, when you ask me straight up, what are some of the angles that I remember, and I remember Ric Flair and Wahoo McDaniel, Indian strap matches. I remember the one angle where Ric Flair took a 2x4 and hit Wahoo McDaniel in the head with it, and they showed it from the Greensboro Coliseum on TV, and he opened up Wahoo's head, and Wahoo said it had nails in it and everything, and he was bleeding, and he came on TV with his head all bandaged up. And I agree, Wahoo was one of the legitimate tough guys in our sport. Not every guy who wrestled was a legitimate tough guy, but Wahoo McDaniel was. And that was during a magical time back then. And I agree with Ric Flair. I had Ric Flair on my radio show over a month ago, and we asked him who he thought should be in the WWE Hall of Fame. First one he said would be Arn Anderson. He said AA because of singles, and then he mentioned Wahoo McDaniel, and I agree.
Of course, at the end of '85, that's when we start to see Arn and Ole teaming with Rick and Tully. Arn, of course, gets the credit for naming them the Four Horsemen during a promo with Tony Schiavone, and we covered all of that in our Horseman episodes. Those are available now in the archives, and I encourage everyone who hasn't heard episode 1, go check that out for sure. Now, the next thing on the horizon, and Arn has always referred to this as his world title, that's how important it was to him, is the NWA World Television title, the old red belt. If you're a belt collector, this is one of the more iconic championships from the era. He would defeat Wahoo McDaniel in a tournament final on January 4th, 1986. And because of this, you would see a lot of pictures floating around in the magazines and stuff like that of Arn as both the television champion and the national tag team champion. And that goes for a few months before the national tag titles are eventually abandoned in March. But it's a pretty big deal when a guy has the opportunity to carry two belts at once, one as a single and one as a tag. It felt like at this point, the promoters really had a lot of faith and confidence in Arn Anderson. Does that sound right to you?
Oh yeah. You had to, again, and I can't stress enough how important it was back in the day. Yeah. Work was good, but not everybody saw you work unless they watched television. You know, most wrestling fans, the idea of Conrad, and everybody needs to understand this, the idea was to try to get you to the arena to see wrestling matches. But most fans, if everybody who watched a television show came to the arena, they would sell out everywhere. Most of the fans watched you wrestle on TV for a short period of time, and it was an enhancement match. But you got over by talking, and Arn Anderson was one of the greatest talkers, and that's why he had two belts at one time.
Well, it's a big deal, and obviously that singles belt, the television title, is one that Arn was particularly proud of. July 5th, 1986 is the Great American Bash. We would see Arn and Ole defeat Sam Houston and Nelson Royal, and he would start working with Magnum TA, and he called at various points TA one of the most intense and stiff guys that he ever worked with. Did you ever have any sort of conversations with Arn about working with Magnum?
I did not, but I had a conversation with Tully Blanchard about working with Magnum. And Tully told me one time, he said, listen, Terry Allen basically grew up wrestling and lifting weights. So as far as athletic ability, doing other things, he didn't have that. So he was very tough to work with. In other words, Magnum was strong, and Magnum lifted weights, and he was a amateur wrestler. So those type of guys are normally stiff. And Magnum, by watching his interviews, you could tell how intense he was. So that comment by Arn was pretty well known from the boys that work with him.
Ronnie Garvin is the next guy that Arn is programmed with here, and somewhere Arn said, "I would have rather found a building to jump off of," which is a classic Arn Anderson line. Was that kind of the rap on everything, Ron Garvin, that he was just stiff? And give me some feedback on Ron Garvin and his feud here with Arn Anderson.
Well, I knew Ronnie really, really well. I think I mentioned on an episode of an earlier episode of What Happened When Monday on the MLW Radio Network that I was with Ronnie in Detroit when he won the world title. And I went out to dinner with him when he won the world title. Ronnie always tried, and there are a lot of guys like this, they always tried to make it look more than real. In other words, when you were working with Ronnie Garvin, you were going to get beat up. You really were. I saw he and Flair go toe-to-toe sometime thinking that, I know these Flair chops are stiff, but, man, you got to really be able to take a punch with Ronnie Garvin going against you. And, everybody liked Ronnie. He was a good guy, still a great guy. I got to see him recently. But, man, he didn't know how to throw a working punch.
Right.
He didn't. It was a shooting punch from Ron Garvin. And when you go to the matches and watch him work, you'd think, man, these guys are really in a fight. And, yeah, they really were when they were fighting Ronnie Garvin.
Great American Bash 86, the Rock and Roll Express are working main events everywhere in 86. And here they're working with Arn and Ole, and they go to a draw. But let's fast forward to September of 86. This is where we would see the guy who Arn has said was the most characteristic performer he ever worked with, and that's Dusty Rhodes, defeat Arn to win the NWA television title. Did you have conversations with Arn about working with Dusty? Because it feels like Dusty had a bit of a love-hate relationship with Ric Flair, and because of that, maybe the rest of the Four Horsemen. Is that a fair assessment? Where do we get the word hate with? As far as would that be ego driven? I think Rick was upset with the idea that Dusty was leaving the Horsemen laying every week and blah blah blah. He felt like maybe the booking wasn't doing the Horsemen justice. Now, I don't think that was necessarily real life, but certainly in wrestling, he may have been upset about that.
Yeah, I guess I can see that. The other, and I don't ever want to dispute anything those guys said because they traveled all the time and they were closer to Dusty really than I was, but they were all making money, you see. So I don't know where the hate would come in because everybody was making money. But there was no question that working with Dusty back in the Crockett days meant you were working on top. So that was a big deal to be able to work with him, and Dusty knew how to work a crowd probably better than anybody else. And Dusty was smart, and everybody knows this, to the fact that Dusty would always put himself in the ring with someone who could work, and that would make Dusty look better.
Let's get to Starrcade 86. This is one of the matches that hardcore Arn Anderson fans really talk about. Arn and Ole are in a steel cage working against the Rock and Roll Express for the tag team titles. The Rock and Rolls are the champs, and they retain the championship belts here. But a lot of people consider this to be one of, if not the greatest tag team cage match ever. Is that something you could echo for Starrcade 86?
No question. Two of the great heels, two of the great baby faces. Everybody was over, and nobody could sell like the Rock and Roll Express. And they had a big fan. This was in the day. This was back. We're talking about 1986. When guys like Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson were over with the girls big time. We're also over with the fans, but we're also over as baby faces. I'm not so sure that in this day and age that Ricky and Robert's stuff would play. Well, I know it wouldn't. You know it wouldn't either because fans have changed. But back then, when Arn and Ole and Ric Flair and the Horsemen did something in a cage, there was legitimate heat back then. And this will go down as one of the great matches, really, of all time. You're right, tag matches.
And, Tony, we should take a break right here to let everybody know that you're still calling people whenever they pick up a shirt. We're striving to go ahead and pay for this Schiavone wedding. And the best way to support the show is to do exactly that. Not everybody needs a mortgage, I get that. But everybody needs to look cool and support their favorite show at the same time. And there's no better place to pick up these cool shirts than ProWrestlingTees.com/WHW. That's ProWrestlingTees.com/WHW. You get to relive all the funny Tonyisms that we've had here on the show. Eat, sleep, block, repeat. The Great American Block Party, Pasta Steel Rules, The Blockmaster, Lois Rules, Blonde Dick, The Hot Tag, I'm a Tom Zink Guy, Syracuse Slapdicks, Button on a Fur Coat, The Panty Monster, Old Commentary Ninja, Parker's Jump Rope Academy. We're out of time. Bill's Glass Bottom Boat Rides, Flair Headed First, Like a Coffin on Roller Skates, Damn I'm Good, My wife picked this out. What a slapdick. Hypothetically, hard to beat, and maybe my new favorite. It's an airbrush t-shirt, just like Panama City Beach circa 1999. Tony and Tom, what happened when? What happened when you bought a shirt? Well, Tony called to thank you. Make it happen right now. Support your favorite podcast and go to ProWrestlingTees.com/WHW. So, Tony, I kind of want to jump around a little bit now because I feel like a lot of the stuff that was really during the early days of the Horseman we've covered in our Horseman episode. Let's just bounce around a little bit. You know, he loses in the Crockett Cup to the Armstrongs. A lot of people are critical of Bob Armstrong in hindsight, but at the time, Arn growing up in the South and working all through the Alabama territory, Bullet Bob was over like Rover, right?
Tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. A great mind for the business. And Arn Anderson never had a problem putting over Bullet Bob Armstrong, and he shouldn't have.
A Great American Bash, of course, in '87 is when we see the very first War Games. Most people think, Arn included, that the first War Games was the best one. Do you concur?
Oh yeah, there's no question. Because of the buildup, because of the unknown, because of the heat that the Horsemen had back then. And because back then you could juice your ass off. So it all lended for a pretty violent double ring, double cage match. Plus, JR and I did the commentary, which I thought was pretty good.
We've touched on this before, but a lot of guys, Arn included, butted heads with Nikita Koloff around this same time. And one of the problems that Arn had, according to the rumor and innuendo, is that Nikita tried to keep up kayfabe even with the boys and pretend that this character was a shoot. And maybe he didn't treat the underneath guys properly. Arn has always been the guy to come out and champion the enhancement talent. He takes issue with the term jobber. He prefers the term carpenter. Give me your 2 cents on the heat with Nikita and the way Arn felt about enhancement talent.
I started traveling with Nikita for a short period of time, and Arn Anderson would get me to the side. He said, "You know why he's traveling with you, don't you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because nobody else wants to have anything to do with that motherfucker." And I then realized that Nikita had a lot of heat with the boys, and it was because Nikita kept up the kayfabe. You know, somebody got to him. I don't know who it was, or he had it in his mindset that when he was going to be Nikita Koloff, he really was going to be Nikita Koloff. And he wasn't that friendly of a guy. He was very standoffish with the guys. And Arn Anderson was a very talkative, jovial, everybody get together and everybody have a good time. And Nikita was not like that. They were two complete different personalities. So, yeah, I knew Nikita had a lot of heat, and I heard it from Arn.
Let's talk a little bit about, the Barry Windham version of the Horseman, because this is the version that Arn has said he felt like was the best working version. It's Rick, Arn, Tully, and Barry Windham. Specifically on Barry Windham, Arn has come out and said that he thought Barry Windham was a phenomenon and that he could stay up all night, have a beautiful woman on his arm, and then wrestle 90 minutes the next day and do all of this without ever going to the gym. Arn's on record as saying something like, Barry could have been the best for as long as he wanted to be. Is that kind of the 2 cents that you have about Barry Windham as well?
Barry Windham was maybe, quite possibly, the most natural talent of any worker ever. Dustin Rhodes was a lot like this when he started, but Barry was just phenomenal. And nobody drank like Barry. And nobody stayed up as late as Barry. And no one... Now, see, this thing about Barry not going to the gym, I mean, Barry did not have the cut body of everybody else, but I didn't realize Barry never went to the gym. I thought everybody went to the gym and at least worked on their cardio. But Barry was phenomenal. You know, for me, and this is because deep in my heart, I'm very, very old school. To me, the best incarnation of the Horseman, I've said this before, was the one with Ole there.
Right.
But Barry really brought a different look to it because of what he could do in the ring. And
he probably, hung out with the guys more than Ole did. So it did feel more like a party unit.
Listen, Ole never hung out with the guys at all.
Right.
Zero. Yeah, it was more of a party unit.
Tully and Arn win the tag titles from the Rock and Roll Express in '87. And Arn's been on record as saying that the Rock and Roll Express feud that he had was probably the most fun he ever had. Just their string of matches, whether he was with Ole or he was with Tully, he really enjoyed working with Ricky Morton. And he thinks that Ricky's probably the most over guy at the time with the ladies he had ever worked with. And they were just super fun matches. Do you remember having conversations with Arn about who his favorite, because a lot of people kind of associate Arn as being the tag team specialist. But he's more of an individual who could be very effective with various different tag partners, whereas the Rock and Roll Express were more of a team, so to speak. Did you ever have conversations with Arn about that?
Well, let me tell you why Arn liked working with the Rock and Roll Express. There are two reasons. As far as because they were so over, and because you could really get a heat on Ricky Morton, something that we talked about for so long. And as a heel, you could get a great heel reaction and get a lot of heat, which as a heel made you feel like you were doing your job. But there was another reason, and Arn Anderson liked working with Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson, had a lot of fun, was every time that you would go to the ring with these guys, you knew that these guys would take care of you. Unlike Ronnie Garvin, who would beat the shit out of you.
Right.
Ricky and Robert were easy to work with, and they weren't as quote unquote stiff. So you felt that you had more of a match that you could do a lot of things with. You wouldn't come out hurt unless something unusual happened, and it was just, and you would have a good match without getting the shit beat out of you. And that's something that Arn liked, and something Arn talked about a lot, because the guys, when you work every night and twice on Sunday, you got to have easy matches or your body's not going to be able to take it. That's why he had a lot of fun, because Ricky and Robert knew how to quote unquote work.
Sting and Lex Luger wind up defeating Arn and Tully to win the '88 Crockett Cup. And then we see a Clash of the Champions that ends in a double DQ with Arn and Tully on one side, Sting and Dusty on the other. Not too long after that, in July of '88, we see the Road Warriors and Dusty Rhodes beat Flair, Arn, and Tully to capture the vacant six-man tag team titles. And we start to head towards trouble here because we see the Great American Bash end in a draw. And then in September, the Midnight Express defeat Tully and Arn to win the tag team titles, and that goes down on September 10th, and that is the very last match that we would see with Arn and Tully in the NWA on their way to the WWF. And Cornette says they've argued as to who would be the heels in the angle, but Dusty made the Midnight Express the baby faces, and that angle worked for a few weeks until Arn and Tully left. So let's talk about the departure and them leaving, and we've touched on this in our Horseman episode before. According to the rumor and innuendo, Arn says that they left because coming out of the Great American Bash, the gates were up, the houses are up, they've been promised on a contract by Crockett that they were going to get a bigger payoff from an earlier pay-per-view that never came through. And this is at a time when some guys like the Road Warriors are getting guaranteed money deals that are for significantly more. And Tully specifically says that their payoff was less than J.J. Dillon's for that show. And they want to be done with this. Allegedly, they try to address this in Houston at TV. And he says Jim Crockett didn't handle it properly, in his opinion. So Arn went and called Vince McMahon. Vince, saying how, integral these guys were to the competition, can't wait to get them some first-class plane tickets and fly them to Stamford. They go to Vince's house, and this is all while they're still working for Jim Crockett. And they sit by Vince's pool and put together a deal. And then they fly back to Philly that night and tell Dusty, tonight's our last night, and they drop the title to the Midnight Express. Is that the way you remember that going down?
Yeah, that's the way it went down. A couple of things here that fans have to realize. There was no competition with going to Vince's house in Greenwich, and I was there too, compared to talking to Jimmy Crockett. if you went to Greenwich and you sat by the pool, you thought, man, this is the major leagues. Jimmy Crockett and the Crockett family and David Crockett and Francis and Jackie are always close to my heart. But the realization is, and I'm sure Jimmy Crockett now would say this, Jimmy was not an easy guy to deal with. He wasn't as personable a guy as Vince McMahon. And I had heard, look, I heard stories, and I just heard one recently when I was at the Icons of Wrestling, and I'm going to bring this up, and this is going to make you smile. But Robert Gibson was talking to me about traveling with Tommy Young. and he said that they were on the road one time, and they were comparing paychecks, and Tommy Young got a bigger paycheck than the Rock and Roll Express did at one time, according to Robert Gibson. Now, take that what you will. I'm not going to throw any heat on Tommy Young at all, because Tommy deserved money. And what I'm trying to portray here is that Jimmy Crockett was not an easy guy to deal with, was not easy to talk to because of his personality. And I had heard a lot of times the boys didn't get paid what they should have gotten paid.
Maybe.
And we were making big money.
Maybe instead of Ricky, Robert should have been looking for the hot tag from Tommy Young on Jim Crockett. Maybe Crockett was Tommy Young.
Maybe so. But look, Rock and Roll Express, everybody in the business always thought they should have gotten paid more.
Sure. Well,
and
they still do.
When you thought you should have gotten paid more and you went to Jimmy Crockett with it, it usually wasn't a good talk. Because Jimmy could be combative at times. He really could. And Vince was just the opposite.
Let's talk a little bit about that run with Vince, because Arn's with the company for 14 months, and he said that he left because they were working 24 days a month on the road. He was never anywhere near Charlotte so he could drive home. He's got a 3-year-old son at the time who's calling him and asking him, when are you coming home? Eventually, Arn cracks with the schedule and makes a deal to come back to WCW, which was only working 8 days a month at the time. So a significant travel distance or difference. And that return is supposed to happen in December of '89. And Arn made this deal with Tully to reform the Horsemen, and everybody's going to get $250,000 each. But before Tully leaves the WWF, he flunks a drug test for cocaine, and allegedly, when Jim Herd finds out about it, he pulls Tully's deal and uses that news as leverage to cut Arn's deal, because they're less valuable if they're not a tag team. And Arn goes from $250,000 down to $100,000, even though Arn didn't do anything wrong. But in Herd's opinion, at least from a negotiation standpoint, he didn't think Arn was as valuable as a singles wrestler. Is that the story you've heard?
That is the true story. And what the fuck did Jim Herd know?
Right.
Every time I hear that story, it pisses me off even more. Not only because I'm an Arn Anderson friend and a fan, but because that's just not the way to run a business.
Let's
look, Jim Herd ran his business by chaos, by pitting people against the other, by pissing people off. And that's not the way you run a business, especially not the way you treat somebody like Arn Anderson.
Very quickly, once he returns, he wins the television title, defeating the Great Muta. We haven't talked about the Great Muta much here on the show. Do you got any Great Muta knowledge you can drop on us, Tony?
No, none at all. I'm sorry. I wish I did. I didn't even know him, just by nodding and smiling at him. With the exception of he had some phenomenal matches, and probably had the better matches that he had back in '89 when I was in the WWE.
Let's talk about the beginning of the injury that ultimately would push Arn out of wrestling. Sometime in '89, when he's working for the WWF, he's working at Madison Square Garden against the Rockers, and Marty Jannetty hooks him up for a victory roll, but Arn doesn't tuck his head in time, and he lands on his head first on the mat. This cracks his C5 vertebrae. He wrestles later that very same night in Boston but he has totally wrestled almost the entire match. I don't even know that Arn actually got in. Let's fast forward now into early 1990. Sometime in 90, he and Ole were wrestling the Steiners, and his right arm goes dead during the match after he took a power slam. His bicep starts to atrophy and never comes back. Rather than take the time off for surgery, he just rehabs for 3 months and doesn't actually get it fixed. Is this the genesis of the injury as well as you know it?
Yeah, that's the way it happened. And I can only think when you're going through that Arn Anderson was a product, and that injury and the deterioration of his arm and his neck was a product of the time. Guys never wanted to take time off because they felt if they took time off, someone would get their spot. I don't know how it is today. Maybe you know better than I do, Conrad. Maybe guys, there's much more available to the guys today. And it wasn't until later, as you probably know, that we even had a trainer that traveled with the guys, like teams do, because we were a team. But Arn Anderson should have gotten it fixed, should have gotten surgery, but he didn't want to get surgery because he felt that if he would have been down for any time at all, that there wouldn't have been a spot for him when he came back. That's a terrible thing to say about our business. And Arn Anderson grew up in the territories and grew up to the time to where when you worked, you got paid, and if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. And there was also something about the Crockett's apparently had an insurance plan in effect. Have you heard this story?
I'm not sure.
Okay. The Crockett's apparently, I don't know, and I'm not going to tell you the time frame, but the Crockett's apparently had an insurance plan in effect for wrestlers, trying to keep wrestlers around by saying, okay, we're going to give you insurance. But apparently the insurance premiums were not paid on time, and the boys didn't know this. And this is a very sore spot with Arn Anderson. I'm not going to throw any names about who didn't pay or who didn't pay. But Arn Anderson does not have a very good feeling, a good taste in his mouth about the Crockett family because of problems with insurance.
Well, so
and that is probably a reason that he didn't get surgery. Now, I'm not going to say the Crockett's were involved at that time, but as you can see, going through, you don't have surgery, you don't have medical benefits, you got to wrestle every night, you're not going to get paid, and then you get insurance, but the insurance is not there as you think, and now you got to have surgery later on. You just don't trust anything. You just keep on working. And that's what Arn did.
Let me freestyle it with Francis.
Yeah. That's what I was told.
Okay.
And I hate to say that because
you didn't.
I love
did.
Francis.
You didn't. I did.
Yeah.
You can heap the shit on me. Hey, it's Conrad. I'm the bad guy that Francis didn't pay for Arn's insurance.
Yeah.
It's my fault.
Yeah. She was in charge of it and apparently didn't pay the premiums, and the boys didn't know it, and the boys thought they had health insurance, and they didn't.
Well, that's a sad story, and this is a sad story here too, because February 2nd, 1991, this had to be a very emotional day for you. I mean, you talk about mixed emotions here. Arn Anderson wins the TV title, which sounds like, well, hey, he's my friend. Why would I be sad about that? He had to defeat the Z-Man to do this.
Did one of them, what was the finish? A roll-up?
I don't know.
Standing switch?
You were calling the shit. Standing switch sounds like something you do in the bedroom.
Okay. Standing switch into a front chancery, into a roll-up, into a spine buster. Woo! You do know we got to get in touch with the Z-Man. You do know that because that motherfucker is over again because of you and me.
I feel like you next week need to have. Are you familiar with Craigslist, or have you stopped getting your hookers on there? You still get your hookers on there? Well, they have a tab called Misconnections, and you could just pour your heart out to a stranger. And I feel like next week here on the program, we should have Tony Schiavone write a Craigslist misconnections to the Z-Man. I think that's good for what ails us. All right, let's keep it going here. May 19th, Bobby Eaton defeats Arn Anderson to win the television title. That goes down at Super Brawl. I mention this because we have pretty routinely talked about Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton as being two of the most talented performers in the history of WCW. And Arn has gone on record as saying that Bobby was one of his very best friends in the business. And he says as close as he was with Bobby is as close as he was with Flair. And I don't think a lot of people associate that. I think a lot of people assume that Flair and Arn were best friends and Bobby was just, somebody they were friendly with. But Arn thinks that Bobby is one of the best friends he ever had. What can you tell us about their relationship and, their work together?
Well, they were much the same type of guy. They were in what I call the redneck radius of Rome, Georgia, and Huntsville, Alabama.
Sure.
And so they bonded that way, and they were much the same in that. Listen, Bobby Eaton and Arn Anderson as a shoot. There are some, you talk to me and you say, was this guy a good guy? Was this guy a good guy? Was this guy a good guy? Yeah, no. Some of them were. As a shoot, Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton were, and they were guys you wanted to hang out with. They were true friends. You trusted them. They were good workers. They were performers. And again, it's that redneck connection that, as you know, with your friends that you have.
I love you for that. Let's talk about the Enforcers. This happens around the summer of 91. Arn is now teaming with Larry Zbyszko here. And I think this is kind of a forgotten version of an Arn Anderson tag team. I don't think people talk about this one enough. What can you tell us about Arn and Larry Zbyszko? This feels like the most hilarious group of traveling companions in the history of car rides.
Yeah, it was. Arn Anderson would always say, why are they booking me with that fucking cigar store Indian? And that was a reference to the fact that Larry Zbyszko just stood in the corner and didn't do anything. And Arn Anderson said, I'm doing all the fucking work. And he just standing there in the corner like a cigar store Indian, not making the tag. And Larry would do that. Larry would have Arn do most of the work. And it was hilarious. The back and forth that they had was hilarious. But they both, respected each other a great deal. And even today, when I talk to Larry, I ask him how you doing, you old cigar store Indian? And that's because of what Arn Anderson said about him.
That was not a part of my wrestling speak, but it is right now. Thank you for sharing that. Cigar store Indian.
Cigar store Indian. Larry Zbyszko standing in the corner like a cigar. He said, I reach up for the tag, and he ain't there. He's standing in the corner like a. That was an Arn Andersonism. But they were good because they could both talk, and they could both wrestle when Larry felt like he wanted to. And it was a great dynamic. It really was.
Let's talk about, I can't believe that a lot of people sleep on this, but Arn and Larry actually beat the Steiner brothers for the WCW tag team titles. And eventually they lose those belts to Ricky Steamboat and Dustin Rhodes. Dustin was announced, but Steamboat was a mystery partner, and he came to the ring wearing a huge dragon head. I feel like Arn Anderson had a field day in the back with that shit.
Absolutely.
But the rib was on him.
Things like that.
The rib's on him, though. Starrcade 91 was the lethal lottery, and I'm sure Arn wanted to kill somebody when he found out he would be working a tag match with Lex Luger, Z-Man, and Terry fucking Taylor. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when they showed him that. Arn and Bobby Eaton actually form a tag team of their own, and they win the tag titles back from Steamboat and Dustin in January of 92 at a house show. I know that Arn's favorite tag partner was Tully, but Bobby Eaton's probably got to be right underneath Tully for Arn, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, he was, because he was one of the great workers. He really was. And again, what did they call that tag team?
Well, I think you just called it the Redneck Radius. We'll go with that. The
Redneck Radius or the White Trash Boys or something. I don't know. Something like that you could have called them.
They made it happen. The Wrestle War 92 is one that we're going to cover long form at some point, I'm sure. We've got Sting's Squadron defeating the Dangerous Alliance. the Dangerous Alliance at the time is Arn Anderson, Beautiful Bobby, Larry Zbyszko, Rick Rude, and Steve Austin. And a lot of people consider that to be one of the more underrated heel factions in history. The idea being you're going to have kind of like an updated version of the Horsemen, and Rick Rude is going to be the leader. Arn adds a little bit of Horseman legitimacy to it, and you've got outstanding workers and Larry Zbyszko there too. We haven't really talked about the Dangerous Alliance much. What did Arn think about being with this group?
I think Arn liked being with the group. And this was a Dangerous Alliance that had Paulie Dangerously as their mouthpiece, right?
That's correct.
How can you not go wrong there?
Yeah, I mean, you've got, in my opinion, obviously I love J.J. Dillon, but I think as far as the mouthpiece, Paulie is a much better promo. And then you've got still Arn and Beautiful Bobby are tremendous workers. Steve Austin's going to be one of the biggest performers in the history of the business. Rick Rude had charisma for days. It's a really strong unit, and it's a shame that they were in WCW in 92 and not maybe, 88 or 98. Timing's everything, but in a different era, a few years one way or another, this group would have done really, really big business. It just happened to come around at a time when the business was down.
Yeah, it did, but it isn't odd that we had so many great stars and so many great talkers, and as you can see, they put Arn Anderson as part of that, because he fit that mold of great talker, great worker.
Eventually, the Steiner brothers capture the tag team titles from Arn and Bobby again, and Arn is doing his best to make some chicken salad. He's bouncing around here, and he's kind of a bit of a ship without a sail. Halloween Havoc 92 feels like a good one to mention. We've got Z-Man and Johnny Gunn and Shane Douglas taking on Arn, Michael Hayes, and Bobby Eaton. There was a Clash of the Champions with Kensuke Sasaki and Eric Watts defeating Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton. And this is during the Bill Watts era. And around this time, Bill Watts actually cuts his salary in half, and Arn leaves the company for a few months. Any memories of this salary cut and Arn making a decision to walk?
Well, yeah, Bill Watts came in with a gigantic cleaver, and he was cutting things right and left, and Arn Anderson he couldn't. Arn was like me in the way that, and Arn is still married to Erin, and that says a lot about him, don't you think, in the business?
It's worth mentioning that everything about Arn Anderson is a little weird. And that Arn Anderson has since he got in the business, has worked continually. So you're talking about over 30 years with really no gaps in employment. You're also talking about a guy who still lives in the same town, and I think in the same house for more than 20 something years now. Been married to the same woman. In wrestling, a lot of times there are multiple wrestling wives, and you've got, little different families and hubs based on the territories you're in. Arn's with the same woman, in the same house, in the same line of employment the entire time. Everything about Arn is a little weird, and in a good way.
Right. It's one of the reasons that he and I bonded so well is because we both had the same values, which were our family life. And even though that Arn traveled a lot and was away from his family much more than I was, that was important to him. So for Arn Anderson to have his pay cut it's not only the fact that Arn Anderson didn't like it, he couldn't do that. He absolutely, Bill Watts cut my pay too. So Arn wasn't the only one that was affected by Bill Watts.
The decision to come back is based out of necessity, or did they communicate and work something out?
They were both, but it's out of necessity.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's not popular to talk about, but man, people got bills. You got to go to work.
Yeah, I know. You got kids. You got family.
Yeah. Arn didn't get a lot of heavyweight title shots in his career, but he did get one at Slamboree in 93. Barry Windham would defeat him to retain Barry's NWA World Championship title. Was there ever any consideration to giving Arn an opportunity to run with the big belt that you remember?
No, there wasn't, and it was something that we discussed a lot, not Arn and I, but a lot of us in the back, that why shouldn't they let Arn Anderson at least win it one time? They let Tommy Rich win it many years ago, and it didn't last long. So what would it have hurt if Arn Anderson won the title at a house show and then dropped it a week later or so?
Right.
We all thought that should have been done. No question.
Well, what should have been done is the Horsemen getting back together. And in May of 93, it looks like Arn, Ole, and Rick are going to reform the Horsemen, and Tully's supposed to come back and join, but Arn has said that Tully wanted a certain amount of money and a set amount of dates to work. Arn says he has a problem with that because none of them had set dates at the time. So instead, they call an audible when they're not able to work this deal out with Tully. Tully's testimony is that the money was said to be one thing, and then when it actually came time to put pen to paper, that was not the case. So instead, Paul Roma joins the Horsemen, and Arn has called Roma a glorified gym rat. Roma has had no shortage of bad things to say about Rick and Arn. Was this the worst version of the Horsemen when you've got an aging Ole Anderson and Paul fucking Roma in the group?
Yeah, it was the worst version of the Horsemen. Now, I'm not familiar with what Roma had to say about Flair and Arn, but what in the world right would he have to talk about those guys?
Well, you know, they're upset because they're old and they're slow and they don't look as good as me and they can't get the women I can and blah, 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 blah.
As a shoot? That was a shoot interview?
Oh, yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Know your role.
Clash of the Champions 93, we see Arn and Rick defeat the Hollywood Blondes in 2 straight falls, which is kind of a big deal because Rick and Arn, you know, while they did a lot of tag team work over the house show loops for many, many years, they didn't work together as a team very often on pay-per-views. You could get a handful of times, but it didn't happen very often. And the Blondes at the time were one of the more prominent teams in the organization. And I think history has probably forgotten this, but Paul Roma and Arn Anderson were actually tag champs together. They defeated Steve Austin and Lord Steven Regal. Regal was subbing for Brian Pillman. And this gives Arn and Paul the belts. They don't keep them for long, though. They drop them to the Nasty Boys at Fall Brawl 93. You got any memories of Arn tagging with Paul Roma? It feels and looks, even all these years later, kind of out of place.
Well, we covered one of the events on one of the earlier editions of What Happened When, where Roma and Arn were tagging together. And when Roma came to the ring, and I'm watching it again, Roma came to the ring and he didn't, you could tell that he was very much to himself, to the point to where if you look into it and read into it, you're thinking maybe that Roma's going to turn on Arn. In reality, Roma knew he was doing the job that night. He was the guy doing the job.
Right.
So that tells me of any friction or any problems they had as a tag team, that Roma didn't feel comfortable about doing the job for the Horsemen, and it made for a very odd and disjointed tag team.
Let's talk about, and we've only touched on this briefly, the Arn and Sid stabbing incident. I know you weren't there, but you're obviously really good friends with Arn. Briefly carry us through in your stories that you've heard from Arn. What happened?
Well, let me tell you this. I am good friends with Arn. Arn did not want to talk about it that much. And Arn was very talkative about a lot of things, but Arn didn't want to talk about it that much because in reality, there could have been, and I guess there was close to being, a lawsuit. And something like this could have put Arn Anderson in jail, don't you think?
Well, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
stabbing folks on both sides. Folks. I mean, this is not wrestling anymore.
No, it's not wrestling anymore. And I'm going to, I have since seen interviews on this from many different parties. And I'm going to take a stand here. If you go back and you read about it, or you look, everybody has to own up to their own mistakes. Mm-hmm. But those mistakes were caused by a shit tour where guys were put into a pretty bad spot. Long plane rides, no rest, not much food, and more bus rides on top of that. Vader is on record to blaming the promotion for what happened. it is well known that when you went out on the road back then, when boys went out on the road to a different country, and they were in Germany, to where nobody is speaking your English, speaking your language, and the communication is hard, and you're way, way far away from your family and your loved ones, and you have terrible traveling conditions, and you have little food, and you drink a lot, that things like that happen. And I know it's something Arn Anderson regrets, because he could have been arrested for it. Sid Vicious was not a very light guy, and had a temper, and Arn Anderson just snapped. I think if I remember right, they flew into Germany. They got on a bus. They traveled like 5 hours to a town, and they wrestled that day. And then they got on a bus and traveled 5 hours to the next town without sleeping. And then they were ordering food, and the food went to the room, and the order got messed up. And I'm not defending Arn Anderson for snapping, but I can see how guys would snap.
Right. Because
apparently, and I'm blaming WCW, and I'm blaming the German promoters. Apparently, they didn't give a shit about the guys. We'll fly them whatever it takes to fly to Germany, 8 hours, 10 hours, put them on a bus for 5 hours. You got to work, put them on a bus for another 5 hours. Can you imagine? Shit, minor league baseball doesn't do that.
Right.
They don't treat their guys like that. And we're talking about major stars. So it's not something that Arn talks about much, and I don't blame him. I know Sid Vicious has done interviews about it. I know Too Cold Scorpio has done shooting interviews about it. I can't do a shoot interview about it because I was not there, but I'm a friend of Arn Anderson, and I could see where he would snap.
Well, let's talk about something that you've probably never seen. Arn Anderson and ECW. This is something that a lot of people probably even forget happens, but it's May of '94. Bobby Eaton tags with Sabu against Arn Anderson and Terry Funk. Any memories of this happening? Did you ever see a tape? Was there ever a conversation with him about working in ECW?
I never even heard of it until right now. Never even heard of it, but my God, Sabu and Terry Funk. And this was this after he started having neck problems?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah, this is '94.
Yeah, this is a guy that obviously really wanted to support his family, because I don't know, with all the health problems that I would have had I done that. And I'm sure a lot of wrestlers did throughout the years, but my God.
It feels like a bit of a favor to Paulie Dangerously, in my opinion.
Sure it does. Yeah.
Fall Brawl '94, we get a War Games with the Nasty Boys, Dusty and Dustin, taking on Arn Anderson, Terry Funk, Bunkhouse Buck, and Colonel Parker. Is this one of the weakest War Games of all time?
Yeah, compared to the first one?
Yeah.
Yeah, my gosh.
It feels like it fell off a cliff here.
Yeah, what the bookers are trying to do here is, the booking committee or the bookers trying to do here is trying to recapture the excitement of War Games. And who are we going to put in there? Well, yeah, let's put anybody in there, because the fact that it's just the War Games will sell. And that's not really the case.
Halloween Havoc '94, Dustin Rhodes defeated Arn Anderson. It's kind of funny that 10 years prior, Arn is battling with Dusty, and now he's battling with Dusty's son. Do you ever have any conversations about what Arn thought about working with Dustin in the early days here?
He didn't have a problem with that. He thought Dustin was a very good worker.
Sure. I think everybody did. Yeah. I didn't mean that in a disparaging way. I think everybody knows Dustin's super talented. Right. Starrcade '94, Johnny B. Bad defeats Arn to retain the TV title, but on the main event, Arn actually gets the win over Johnny B. Bad and becomes WCW TV champion again in January of '95. I got to think somewhere in here, Arn has a hilarious way to talk about Johnny B. Bad.
Yeah, he does. And he refers to that glitter gun in the same way that you have here on this program, that he's going to have to go in and wrestle a guy with a 10-foot penis. It's basically what I remember him saying. But again, Arn's a pro, he'll do it.
Uncensored 95. We've talked about this before. Johnny B. Bad knocks out Arn in round number 4 in a boxer versus wrestler match. How would Arn Anderson describe that debacle?
He would describe that as he always would, a clusterfuck. And we covered that one before. That's when they stuck the bucket on his head, remember?
Yes.
Yes. And that's where I called him a buckethead on the air, which to me was one of the highlights of my friendship with Arn Anderson. Being able to call that motherfucker a buckethead on the air after I did for so many years behind the scenes.
Arn Anderson defeats Alex Wright to retain the TV title in Slamboree 95. How would Arn Anderson describe Alex Wright here?
He would say, Jim Barnett's going to love what we're getting ready to do.
June 18th, the Great American Bash of 95. The Renegade beat Arn to win the TV title. Arn would get a rematch at Bash at the Beach, but the Renegade would win again. What did Arn think about losing to the Renegade here? Not once, but twice on pay-per-view.
Well, he would probably say something to the effect, at least I'm not losing to Joe Gomez.
Clash of the Champions, August 6, 95. This is one of the more hilarious moments in WCW to me. Vader beats Arn and Flair in a fucking handicap match.
Oh my God.
And Arn has gone on record as saying that Vader almost killed them both in this match. Your memories of this, or did you ever talk to Arn about the silliness of Arn and Flair losing a handicap match to Vader?
You know, Arn never did talk to me about the silliness of a finish or anything. He always talked to me about what you said about almost getting killed and what went on during the match and having to work against Vader. God, we've seen so many, and you and I have covered so many Vader matches since we've been doing this, that one of the stiffest workers ever. I just can't fathom how Arn Anderson with a bad neck would have even agreed to get into a match like this. Holy shit.
Let's talk about one of Arn's best matches of his career, and certainly one of the more underrated ones. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go watch Fall Brawl 95, because we've got Arn wrestling Ric Flair, and Arn actually gets a victory over Ric Flair. And this is a match that a lot of people thought they would never see, because they're best of friends. They've been in the Horsemen forever. Arn wasn't, quote unquote, at that level. So there's lots of reasons why people thought this would never happen, but it did. And he beats Rick. And Arn's even gone on record as saying this is the only time he's ever thrown up before a match. He says it's all from nerves. He did his pre-match interview, but on his way to the ring, he had to stop and throw up because his stomach was in knots. He never wanted to wrestle Rick because it was his best friend, and he didn't think anybody would buy it. But in hindsight, he thinks it's probably one of the most memorable matches of his career just because of the emotions involved. Did you have a conversation with Arn about this match and what it meant to him or Rick?
Well, look, I knew what it meant to both of them because they were both very close. And I think that if you say this is a match that no one thought they would see, is a damn good reason to book it. I knew they both had emotions that night. The fact that Flair did the job and was working with his best friend, to me, just made it for a classic moment. Arn was very, you know, Arn says a lot of funny shit, and is very irreverent. But in situations like this, he's not going to talk that much about it.
No, he's not.
He'll keep it to himself.
And it's a big deal. And I encourage everybody to go watch it if you haven't already.
Absolutely.
Nitro, of course, comes to us in the fall of 95, and Flair and Arn are featured pretty prominently here. Flair gets a win over Arn by DQ on October 2nd, and that sets up a cage match the following week. I recommend everybody check that out. It's October 9th, 1995. Arn beat Flair in a steel cage match, so it's a pretty big deal. This sets up, of course, Rick and Sting on one side of the ring, Arn and Brian Pillman on the other, the following week on Nitro, and it builds to Halloween Havoc, where we've got Sting and Flair wrestling Pillman and Arn. You probably have an idea what comes here. The Horsemen are reformed. Chris Benoit eventually is the fourth Horseman, but poor old Sting gets turned on yet again by the dirtiest player in the game. Your thoughts on the way they carried this angle out in this series of Arn and Rick matches?
Well, the Arn and Rick matches were great. The fact that they turned on Sting, to me, was just a great part of the Horseman legacy. And I think I actually enjoyed this little angle that they did, and this run that Arn and Flair did. I think anybody would.
He finishes the year working some matches with New Japan. Obviously, they throw him in the World War III Battle Royal. But the next big thing that happens is January 96. We see Hogan and Savage defeat Flair and Arn on Nitro, which is a pretty big deal. And we've covered this briefly in the past, but I guess we should mention it again here. February of 96 is where we see Super Brawl. It's supposed to be Sullivan and Brian Pillman in a strap match. Pillman goes into business for himself, or one would be led to believe that, but it turns out it was really a worked shoot with he and Bischoff. Well, according to the rumor and innuendo, nobody in the back really knows what to do. So Arn Anderson comes out in street clothes and wrestles Kevin Sullivan. You were there. What happened, and why was Arn the guy to go try to make chicken salad, so to speak?
Well, listen, this was a work shoot, and Arn Anderson is a company guy, and Arn Anderson, I think, realized what it was, and I don't remember that much about it in the back, with the exception of Arn Anderson. Again, I think everything's work.
Right.
Okay? I think Arn Anderson coming out is a work. Whether he actually just said, fuck it, I'll do it, I'm not sure.
Let's talk about something we are sure about, and I know this is forgotten. I'm going to encourage everybody to watch it. February 12th, 1996 on Nitro, Arn Anderson pins Hulk Hogan. It's a pretty big deal when you're able to get wins in 6 months. Hogan at a time when not a lot of people could say that. The following week, February 19th, Arn would beat Hogan by DQ, and of course this is all building towards Uncensored 96, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, because we essentially have the mega powers, Hogan and Savage, taking on the alliance to end Hulkamania, which is Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Lex Luger, Kevin Sullivan, Ming, the Barbarian, Z Gangsta, Ultimate Solution, the IRS, the FBI, Ted Turner, CBS, TNT, USA, Bonnie Hammer, Pat Patterson, Tommy Young. I mean, it's fucking ridiculous. We'll cover it another time.
Oh, God.
Slamboree 96, we see Flair and Savage defeat Arn and Eddie Guerrero. This is another goofy, lethal lottery. Eddie Guerrero is a guy who was kind of on the upswing at the time. Did you ever have a conversation with Arn about Eddie Guerrero and his future in the business?
Arn loved him. Arn thought he was a future superstar and was a good kid who would do anything. And Arn had a lot of respect for him, no doubt.
Things start to get a little weird in real life in 96, and the Bash at the Beach 96 is no different. You've got the Giant and Kevin Sullivan on one side in a tag match, and they're taking on Arn and Chris Benoit. So in theory, it's the Dungeon of Doom versus the Four Horsemen. But in real life, there's a whole lot of shit going on with Kevin Sullivan, his wife Nancy, and Chris Benoit. Does Arn Anderson have an opinion on that you know of?
No, does not.
He didn't think that shit's weird? No conversation?
Well, we all think it was weird, but I don't think when it came to stuff like that, I think Arn Anderson left it alone.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Fall Brawl 96, one of the more iconic pay-per-views in history. I can't wait to talk about it at some point in the future. We've got the NWO, which is Hollywood Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and what we think is Sting, because we've just seen Sting do some dastardly things the prior Nitro. They're taking on the Four Horsemen in War Games, which is supposed to be Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and their two partners from WCW, who aren't really horsemen, but they feel like they can trust, Lex and Sting. But now there's a question because of what happened the prior Nitro. Can we trust Sting? This was really one of the better angles, and happening at a time when WCW is on a major upswing. At this point, is Arn in favor of the NWO storyline? Does he get it? Is everybody excited about it? Or at this point in Arn's career, is this just another day, another dollar?
That's what it is for him. Another day, another dollar in his career. I mean, we're talking about a guy who has pinned Hulk Hogan, a guy who has pinned Ric Flair, a guy who has made a good living in the business, and a guy who is doing exactly what he's doing now, Conrad, and that is just staying and working in the business.
Let's talk.
So for him, it's just another day, another dollar.
He continues that through Halloween Havoc 96, and that's where we would see Luger defeat Arn Anderson by submission. But this is really the beginning of the end, or maybe the end of the end. Because the day before Halloween Havoc, Arn goes to Gold's gym and grabs a couple of 30-pound dumbbells, and they just fell out of his hand and hit the floor. He tried to pick up the weight, but his thumb and first two fingers were unusable. From locking the car door and walking into the gym, a chip moved into a nerve canal and shut down his left hand. So the next day, if you go watch the Halloween Havoc 96 match, you'll see that Arn has no use of his left hand during the match.
Yeah.
1 month later is World War III, 1996. Arn is a participant in the 3-ring battle royal. It's won by the Giant. And sadly, that's Arn's last pay-per-view as a wrestler. Mm-hmm. Do you remember having a conversation with Arn during this time? Was he talking to you about being nervous about providing for his family? Would there be a spot for him in the office? Could he be an agent? How else could he participate? Or was he trying to just pretend it wasn't there and just work through it and rub some dirt on it, as we like to say?
Yeah, he was trying to rub dirt on it, is what he was doing. And Arn and I had a lot of talk about that because, and I had neck surgery in 1995, and he and I both knew what neck problems were about. Now, listen, I had neck surgery in 95, and I'm a slug, okay? I didn't go in and take bumps like he did. And I can only just imagine about having neck problems and taking bumps, because unless you've had neck problems, you have no idea what happens. You can't sleep. Arn and I talked frequently about the fact that neither one of us could get a good night's sleep unless we were sedated at one time. Because you couldn't get comfortable, and you they have all these gimmicks with these pillows and all these things and these mattresses, and nothing ever worked. So he was wearing down. But I don't think, well, I know Arn Anderson was always going to be a part of the business back in WCW back then, because he had a great mind for it. And that's proved out here now in modern day, in current times, because he is an agent and he is one of the best guys, and maybe the best guy, to set up a match.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, don't really understand Arn's level of contribution, because I feel like so many people think, once 97 rolls around, outside of sliding in the ring, at WrestleMania 18 to help Ric Flair in his match against The Undertaker, he's just kind of hanging out in the back. I don't know that they really understand the level of commitment that Arn has to the business, even today, and the confidence that the WWE has. The confidence the WWE has is the face that runs the place. The guy is John Cena, and the guy who's helped John Cena put together all of these pay-per-view and main event and WrestleMania and big-time matches is Arn Anderson. And anytime you see Rick, I'll get it right eventually. Anytime you see John Cena have a barn burner match on pay-per-view and people are like, wow, for a guy that we like to mock that he has 5 moves of doom and blah, 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 he put on a hell of a show there. Somewhere in the back, Arn Anderson's a proud papa. Would you agree with
Arn
that,
Anderson,
Tony?
Arn Anderson, I think, is the guy that sets up all John Cena matches.
Absolutely.
And the reason is because John Cena wants him to set him up.
Sure.
Arn Anderson Arn Anderson is a great communicator of how things should work with the boys. He has a great deal of respect with the guys, as we have documented here today, because of what the time he's put in. But you got to go further than that. You got to be able to communicate finishes with the guys and have a knack for what works and what doesn't work. And Arn Anderson has been one of those guys throughout the years.
Another thing that, I sometimes think I know something about wrestling because I read dirt sheets or watch it, but I don't watch it the same way Arn Anderson does. I had a conversation with him once about a guy on the roster, and he probably doesn't want me to say who, but I said, hey, who do you think's the most underrated? And he said, and I said, why do you think that is? What about him makes him underrated or special? And he said he never does the same combinations of moves. So many guys fall into a habit of routines, drop down, shoulder tackle, blah, 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 whatever it may be. He says this guy switches it up every time. So if you're on a house show loop with him, he'll do it ABC the first night. The next night, he'll do it CBA. The third night, he'll do it BAC. And the fourth night, he'll do it yet another way. And it's different every time, and it works every time because he understands why it works. A lot of times guys are doing moves and they don't understand why they work. This guy understands why they work, so therefore it's no trouble for him to figure out where to put them. But so many other guys become paint by numbers. And that was like a master level explanation of professional wrestling that I don't think a lot of people can get unless they're sitting under Arn Anderson learning tree.
And that's why Vince still uses him. And that's why he's a valuable guy. And that's probably why. And Arn Anderson still puts in a hell of a lot of travel. Conrad, you know that as well as I do.
Crazy amount. I mean,
crazy amount of travel for an old fat guy to do what he does.
You know,
and just amazing.
It's worth mentioning everybody, you know, and we have told funny stories here too, where, you know, we would compare Arn Anderson when he maybe had overindulged as to like a weekend at Bernie's type situation. And that's a funny ha-ha, but it is worth mentioning that, again, when we say everything's a little weird about Arn Anderson, that too, Arn Anderson doesn't drink. And so there's lots of, you know, people out there who think that every time you see Arn Anderson, he's got a case under each arm because Kevin Nash said something on Nitro 20 years ago. He doesn't even drink. So,
no, he's changed his life around from that.
The old partying horseman days are in the 80s. These days,
they're really gone.
Arn's making towns and contributing in a big way. Let's talk about the end of WCW, though. There's a story that Arn was trying to lace his boots at a taping for WCW and Disney. This is very early 1997. And Bischoff notices Arn's hand and asks Arn, "What's wrong with your hand?" Arn tells him that it's been that way for a few months. And Eric tells him, according to the testimony we've heard, to take your boots off and go get it checked out. So Arn finally goes and does something he probably didn't want to do, and that's address what's going on. They do an MRI, and they say that the vertebrae 5, 6, 7, and T1, all of the nerve canals are totally blocked. So by April, Arn has to go in for surgery to fuse the 5th, 6th, and 7th vertebrae in his neck. And his neck was so bad that he was suffering from paralysis in his left hand. And this surgery officially ends his in-ring career. And this is obviously something that is bigger than just wrestling. And we as fans, when we hear this, we just think, oh, well, he's done wrestling. But you've got to appreciate from his perspective, this is all he's ever done. This is his whole life. Everyone in his life he knows because of this. All of his friends, and at this point, all of his family, is somehow ingrained in this business, and he gets his identity from being a contributor to this professional wrestling business. And Arn said that this was so hard for him to deal with that he wanted to die, that this was just devastating news to him. And that the post-op pain is the worst pain he had ever felt. And he wanted to try to figure out how to deal with this pain. And it was so bad that on the second day, when the pain meds aren't working anymore, he wants to make sure all of his affairs are in order because he just cannot deal with this. So he goes through a depression. 3 months after the surgery, a guy comes up to Arn just to say hello and slaps him on the back to say hi. And Arn was holding a glass of water. And when the guy slapped him on the back, he dropped the glass. A jolt of pain goes through Arn's body. And to him, it was confirmation that his career was definitely over. And that incident with the glass of water happened just 4 days before the now famous retirement speech on Nitro that happened 20 years ago this week, August 25th, 1997. What can you tell us about the surgery, the decision to have the surgery, the way Arn felt after, and this whole slap on the back incident when he realizes this is it?
I don't remember the slap on the back incident, but I do remember, obviously I remember one of the greatest interviews or promos, whatever you want to call it, that we've ever had with Arn Anderson. I do remember the depression, and I did understand it. Arn Anderson took bumps. Arn Anderson could have been, legitimately, Conrad, was a bump away from being in a wheelchair. He really was. And that was frightening, looking back on it now. And so I can understand the depression. Arn Anderson was old school and always thought that you had to have some sort of value to the company as a performer to be able to keep a job. And that concerned him, and that scared him. And I knew exactly where he came from. I really did. Arn Anderson and I are alike in a lot of ways, in that we want to provide for our family, and we're scared to death that unless we continue to do our job, we're not going to be able to provide for it. And that's why, and you know what? A pat on the back to Eric Bischoff for finally realizing that Arn Anderson needed to go and get some help for this. This is in no way is it equal to what Arn Anderson suffered, but I had 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 fused in 1995. And when I went to the doctor, my canals were so blocked that the doctor put me in a hard collar and told me that if I would without the hard collar, if I would be rear-ended in a crash or I would have a jolt to the back of my neck or on my back, that I could be in a wheelchair the rest of my life. He told me that. And then I quickly got surgery. Same thing with Arn. He gets a slap in the back, and he realizes that his career is over.
Well, and it's over.
It's a sad moment. It really is.
It's over at a very young age, too. And I feel like a lot of people kind of overlook just how young Arn was there. And part of that, and we've joked about this in the past with J.J. Dillon, it's because, Arn Anderson has looked 40 his entire life. I'm not saying that to be funny, but I'm just saying you look at Arn Anderson in 1987 and you look at him in 1997, he doesn't look that doggone different. He's just kind of always looked the same age. Arn was only 38 years old when he retires and gives that infamous speech on August 25th. To put that in comparison, he's 38 now. Brock Lesnar, who main evented SummerSlam yesterday, 40 years old. John Cena, 40 years old. Randy Orton, 37. Samoa Joe, 38.
Yeah, okay. Listen, they all are 38 in a different era.
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying, imagine if Samoa Joe had to come out tomorrow and announce, hey, this is it. I can't wrestle anymore. People would be like, oh, he's too young.
Right.
But it felt like Arn had been around forever and Arn looked 40 forever. So it just felt like, man, this is a shame. But you don't think about it being 2 years younger than John Cena is today. I don't.
Yeah. No, but the fact is that it has enabled him, the retirement, unfortunately, it's enabled him to have a life afterwards.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of guys his age that can't walk now.
Yeah. And there's a lot of guys who just aren't his age too. That's
exactly.
They just didn't make it. And we're going to talk about the retirement speech and the parody in long form, I'm sure, but let's briefly cover it here. Arn has said the speech is the most real thing he ever did in front of a camera. And he said if he would have seen Rick's face during it, he wouldn't have been able to get through it because it was a real moment to Rick and Arn. As a friend of both, what did that speech mean to you?
To me, it just brought everything together from when I started to what I was doing. It brought back the flood of memories of the great times that we had and what he had meant to wrestling. So it had a personal meaning for me because I was friends with Arn.
We're going to play Arn's retirement speech at the end of this week's show, and I hope everybody stays tuned for that. And I'd like for you to actually see the visual. So fire it up at some point this week on your network. It's August 25th, 1997. It is available on the network. You've got to see it. You'll hear it here, but we want you to see it. And Arn Anderson was one of the all-time greats. In front of the camera, behind the curtain. Tony, in your opinion, what is Arn Anderson's legacy to professional wrestling going to be?
Arn Anderson's legacy to professional wrestling was his interviews are going to be the standard for what interviews should be in the sport. His dedication to the sport is what young guys now should emulate. Not everybody should put their body or their career, their livelihood on the line like Arn did. But everybody should be able to take the ability to work and take the ability to talk and take the love for the business and the respect for the business that Arn Anderson has had and apply it to their craft today. I can't think of anybody better to be able to mold these kids than Arn Anderson. To me, people ask me, and they've said this before, I've gotten this on Twitter, well, who is your Mount Rushmore of wrestling? Well, when you talk about the big stars, you put Hogan, you put Flair, you put The Rock, you put Stone Cold on there. But when you talk about what guys have meant to the business, Arn Anderson's face belongs on the Mount Rushmore of wrestling.
Oh, goodness, of course.
What they've meant to the business, I'm not talking about necessarily what they've meant to the business as far as what the fans have seen, but what they've meant to business as far as what he has meant to
just the contributions
in the backstage area.
Yeah, not just box office, but every piece of it. Every place he can contribute. And I do think, the Mount Rushmore question, which is super popular amongst wrestling fans, it really is a personal thing. It's not saying to me, who drew the most money. Well, now you're just asking for scientific data. There's no debate. It's no opinion. And in your opinion, Arn Anderson's on your Mount Rushmore, and I think he's got to be on mine too. Let's take some questions real fast. Let's do some rapid fire questions from Twitter. We asked you, hey, have a question for Tony Schiavone about the Enforcer? Just reply to this tweet. If you haven't already, throw us a follow on Twitter. We're at WHW Monday. On Facebook, we're facebook.com/WHW Monday. Adam wants to know, why do you think Arn never got a world title push?
Well, that's the $1 million question.
It is.
Maybe he was too valuable in other ways.
Okay. That's not an answer I think I was ready for.
I don't know.
A lot of people would say they didn't feel like Arn had the look, that Arn didn't have the look to be the world champion. But I think if Arn came along 10 years before, he's every bit of the look as Harley Race.
Yeah, or as Dory Funk Jr., or as Jack Briscoe.
But I think maybe the idea is by the late 80s and the early 90s, people were looking for more, matinee idol looks as opposed to a badass you wouldn't want to mess with down at the bar, like a Terry Funk or a Dory Funk or a Jack Briscoe or whomever.
Yeah. There's another side of that. There's another side of that too. Not pointing fingers at anybody.
Sure.
But if Arn Anderson should have gotten a world title shot, why didn't one of the world champions back then go to the promoter and say, you know what, let's put him over and I'll put him over?
Do you think it was almost a Ricky Bobby type situation from Talladega Nights with Rick and Arn, where it was, what if I win once? Well, because I win. Do you?
Yeah.
I need Dave Silva or somebody to take Ric Flair and Arn Anderson's face and put them on the Talladega Nights characters there. Horror Movie Barbecue says, did Arn ever have a suggestion for a horseman that got shot down by management?
Not that I know of. No, not at all.
Fuzz wants to know, any good Arn or and Klondike Bill stories?
You mean together?
Sure.
No.
No, I don't. I don't mean that they went on glass bottom boat rides together. I was asking,
right.
Did Arn have a funny or hilarious take about Klondike Bill and his shenanigans?
Well, Arn called him one of the greatest perverts of all time.
Sure.
And that was about as far as it went.
Late to the Nitro Party wants to know, what was Arn's attitude about Mongo in the Horseman? It seems like Arn and Benoit were tasked with carrying him in all of his matches.
Yeah, Arn Anderson did that, but Arn would say things jokingly, but he would never run down a person or run down a guy. He always tried to make it work, regardless of how limited work rate they had. And I know our buddy Matt Kuhn loves Steve Mongo McMichael, but Arn Anderson tried to make it work with him.
I don't know where this comes from, but it is hilarious just to read this word out loud. Did Arn really give Major Guns a cat bath? I've never even heard that, and maybe that was a promo or something I missed once upon a time. I know it didn't happen in real life, but a cat bath is something that I think I'm going to have to use from now on. So thanks for that, Ivan.
I would have loved to have, if he had, I would have loved to have been there, man.
Jim Ashley wants to know, and this is kind of a fun question. What were Arn Anderson's favorite drinks? We ask because as wrestling fans, we've always heard that Ric Flair loved kamikazes. We know that, Steve Austin loved his Steve Weisers. What was Arn Anderson into?
Beer.
Any particular brand?
Miller Lights.
Oh, I like that.
See, it's part of the redneck radius.
And
was a beer drinker, buddy.
In your opinion, who was a better partner for Arn? Ole, Tully, Larry Zbyszko, or Beautiful Bobby?
Tully.
Was Four Horsemen the faction, with Rick being known as the leader and world champ, the primary reason Arn never got a run as world champ?
That's a good point. That, Arn Anderson, everybody took a back seat to Ric Flair. How many people that were Four Horsemen throughout time became the world heavyweight champion beside Ric Flair?
I mean, I think we've got lots of questions here, and this is a fun one. If Ric Flair had never gotten into wrestling, would we be talking about Double A as the greatest of all time instead?
That's quite possibly, yeah. And we might be talking about him as a world champion. I'm not saying that Flair, look, don't misconstrue this. I'm not saying that Flair prevented that from happening.
No.
But that would have, if there had never been a Ric Flair, Arn may have been elevated to that top spot.
I think we should end this.
He could have grown his hair out, but that would have been horribly looking. That was like, there was a Arn Anderson doll, the first Arn Anderson figure that came out. I grabbed it and looked at it, and it had a bald spot on the back. I don't know if you ever saw that or not. It looked like he had a tan yarmulke on.
I love that.
And I grabbed it and I said, "Hey, are you Jewish?" He said, "What the fuck you mean?" And I showed him the doll. I said, "This thing's got a fucking yarmulke on it." But we always, laughed about washing his hair with a wash rag, and things like that. So, he didn't have the flowing locks, but he could certainly have been elevated to being a world champion.
Dan Ryan on Twitter has a great question we should end the show with, and then a couple of fun stories from you. What were some of Arn's classic one-liners? We've heard the joke about when Arn would pick up a toilet brush and say, "Hey, Luger, I found your toothbrush."
Right.
And we've heard that he had a nickname for everybody. He famously named Ric Flair Beak, which is kind of funny because he has a big nose. I think he called J.J. Dillon Johnny Bench because
his sack full of nuts.
There you go.
Yeah.
So he had these nicknames for everybody. Do you remember any other classic one-liners? You've told us before when Ron Reese was nervous about the Halloween Havoc 95 finish, that when he comes back through the curtain as the Mummy, Arn says, "Scratch everything I said, go kill yourself. That monkey fucking a football gimmick ain't going to get it." So there's lots of fun Arnisms out there. Can you share a few with us now?
He called Luger Mr. Ed too because of his teeth. Had a mouthful of teeth like Mr. Ed. You would have to have watched the old show to realize that. And of course we mentioned he called Zbyszko Cigar Store Indian. He called the Kansas Jayhawks, Bobby Jaggers and Dutch Mantell, a flapjack wino and a man with a throw rug on his back. And that brings me to one of the great Arn Anderson promos that you may never have seen. Arn Anderson and Jimmy Garvin and Precious were going to Lynchburg to wrestle the Kansas Jayhawks. And back that time, they would have a big show like Greensboro where everybody was on it. And then they would have another spot show somewhere else where they would have just like one big main event. And in the other event, it was Jimmy Valiant against somebody. And Arn Anderson was wrestling with Jimmy Garvin and Precious against the Kansas Jayhawks in Lynchburg at the Armory. And I was doing the promo, and I brought in Jimmy Hart and Arn Anderson, and Arn Anderson comes in. I said, in the main event that night, it's the Kansas Jayhawks against gorgeous Jimmy Garvin with Precious and Arn Anderson, and let's bring in gorgeous Jimmy and Precious and Arn. Arn Anderson said, okay, Schiavone, let me get this right. All the main stars, everybody else is going to Greensboro, and they got me in Lynchburg. I'm going to be on top in Lynchburg. And they booked us, Jimmy, with a flapjack wino and a man with a throw rug on his back. And Jimmy Garvin and Precious floating his hair, spraying him with whatever. He said, don't worry about it, Double A, because I'm going to have the private plane, and you can go with me on that private plane, and we're going to leave here from Charlotte, and we're going to fly to Lynchburg. We're going to get rid of the Kansas Jayhawks. We're going to hop in the private plane and get back. It's going to be a great trip. And Arn Anderson said, as we're going to black, ooh, I hope there's whiskey on that plane. 3, 2, 1, and we went to black. One of the greatest local promos ever from Arn Anderson. Arn Anderson also, and this is a story I alluded to, Lois had gone to the doctor. We had 2 kids. Lois had gone to the doctor, and Arn Anderson and I were very good friends, and we were in the back, and I was doing promos, and all the guys in the back, and Lois walked in. She had gone to the doctor, and she was talking to Arn. And Arn completely stopped the interview. Said, everybody stop. Everybody stop. And Arn Anderson always called me a dumpy old sawed-off wop. And he said, I just want to announce to everybody here that our sawed-off, dumpy, old wop has impregnated Lois again, and they're going to have a 3rd baby. Can you believe that? And Lois is smiling, and he's just giving me shit about being a dumpy old wop and impregnating my wife again. So I found out that Christopher, who you met, was going to be born thanks to Arn Anderson amidst the boys that day in the backstage area.
So he knew before you knew?
Yes, he did.
Wow.
I knew Lois had to go to the doctor. I didn't know what it was about, and found out she was pregnant with Chris through Arn Anderson that day. So that's how close he and I have been, and we still talk today. Loving.
Well,
absolutely loving. Just like I love Ric Flair.
I feel like we need one more story before we get out of here. I need you to confirm or deny. Is it true that Arn Anderson once bet Sid Vicious to put a pet squirrel in his pants for 60 seconds? And that Sid not only considered this, but accepted the bet and won. But while he was running around in Sid's pants, the squirrel went nuts, maybe literally, and bit Sid in his gimmicks. And therefore Sid had to go to the emergency room because he wanted to prove to Double A that he could do this. And he won the bet and the money, but he may have lost the war with his nuts in the ER.
Yeah. That I've heard that story is true.
If that right there is not, excuse enough to get in a scissor fight with a man, I don't know what.
I was thinking the same thing. That's a good reason to stab a guy with a scissors. Oh, God bless Arn Anderson.
God bless Arn Anderson, and God bless the Nature Boy Ric Flair. We're going to come to you next week, and we're going to do something totally different. We're going to do another Q&A episode, but this time we're only getting the questions from Facebook. So I encourage you right now, cruise on over to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/WHW Monday, and you're going to see a post right there with an image, and then you'll be able to pile your questions in underneath. You're not going to be restricted to 140 characters like on Twitter. If you've got something that needs a backstory or a little more detail, go ahead and fire it off. And tune in next week when Tony and I take your questions, and nothing's off limits. Ask whatever you'd like to ask. We may not answer it, but you're welcome to ask it. But the only place to ask this question is over at our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/WHW Monday. And Tony, when I look at my clock here, I can't help but feel like it's about that time.
We are going to end this program today with a donut match as Arn Anderson takes on Conrad Thompson in a donut match. Both men are looking for catering guys, and both are going to take these donuts back with them. Tommy Young is waiting in the back. The Barbarian is with him, and Dave Silva, and they all will enjoy the donuts together. Maybe the Barbarian's going to enjoy something else. But we're out of time this week. We'll see you next week on What Happened When Monday.
It's a pleasure to hold the microphone, Mr. Anderson, up for you on this occasion.
Well, Gene, all I can tell you, to get a response like this means what I got to say tonight mean that much more. You see, I'm a realist, and everybody knows I've got average size and speed and average ability, but I've parlayed that into what I would call a very successful career. And I did that on sheer will alone. But another reality is, 4 months ago, they took 4 vertebrae out of my neck. Consequently, I'm left with a hand, my left hand, too weak to hold a glass, too weak to button a button. But I thought in my mind, I knew in my mind I could overcome that too, through sheer will. And I was doing just like that. I think I've come back a long way. But the other day I had something happen in the gym that was like a cold slap in the face of reality. A guy about your size, Gene, came up and he slapped me on the back and he said, "Double A, where you been? We hadn't seen you on TV." And just that slap sent a jolt through me, and I dropped the water I was drinking, and just for a second, my system shut down, and it became crystal clear as I watched the few little drops of water draining out of that bottle, the symbolism that was involved. It was like someone had turned an hourglass over, and the sand was running out on the career of Arn Anderson. Now, the fact of the matter is, not only do I put myself in a suicide situation by trying to wrestle again, I endanger these two men's careers, and I respect them too much for that. And other than be anything than the enforcer in my best friend's eyes, I'd rather walk away. And for all you people out there that have ever bought a ticket to see Arn Anderson wrestle, whether you love me or you hated me, you knew that when that bell rang, you got all I had that night. Whether I won, whether I lost, I gave you everything I had. And you knew that. And when you did this to me, that was your acknowledgement. Well, the fact is, I got nothing left to give. And I want you to remember me as I was, not as I am. But being the man that I am, my last act, formerly as a horseman, I got one last challenge. And that's to you, Curt Hennig. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's not for a fight. You got something special. I've seen you in this ring. Your skills, your maturity, your commitment to excellence makes you something special. And what my challenge is to you, Curt, is stand beside my best friend, Ric Flair, and lead these two men back to the glory and the prominence that the Four Horsemen once had. And I'm going to tell you what your prize is. It's not a spot with the Horsemen, because this is worth a lot more than that to me. I'm going to give you the only thing I got left. Not a spot, not a spot. I'll give you my spot.